Cuba. Sandy beaches, lush jungles, and that ripe smell of fresh Cuban communism.
An unprecedented public demonstration against the Cuban communist regime.
The communist regime in Cuba.
Socialism and communism.
You know the story. Russian submarines, Soviet missiles, and of course, Fidel Castro. Because if you attended American public school, your single-class exploration of Cuban history was probably dominated by Cold War-era fears. Fears that are still deeply entrenched in the way we think about the country to this day. There's a tendency to treat Cuba like our wild, estranged cousin. He seems really fun to be around at family gatherings, but Mom says not to hang out with him because he's into some stuff. But that stuff, those hard things Cubans have endured over the decades, war and embargoes, dictators and revolutions, actually have a lot less to do with Cuba, and a lot more to do with America's historical vision of itself, one that keeps our hands involved in Cuban politics to this very day. You're probably familiar with this vision. You may even believe it yourself, that America is a force for good in the world, bringing freedom and democracy to countries who otherwise wouldn't have a chance. There might be a few bumps in the road or errors that we've made along the way, but overall we've done a pretty good job. And if the rest of the world would just follow in our footsteps, embrace the American way, and let us have unfettered access to their national resources to export and use for our own wealth and economic gain no matter the consequences for the colonized nation, the world would be a better place. We're the good guys after all, right? The answer to that question is a complicated one, and in this series, we're going to explore exactly what America's historic relationship with Cuba means for the present, and uncover why Cuba's modern-day problems are stained by centuries of American imperialism. This is how America broke Cuba. To understand where our love-hate relationship with the island country began, we've got to go back, way back, before Castro or nuclear weapons, to figure out why America involved itself in the first place. So, it's 1845, and America is having a bit of an identity crisis. The borders are expanding westward, new territories are being added, and the annexation of Texas is making Americans think really hard about what the country's place on the world stage will look like. Are we a country that respects and honors the borders of other nations, or do we follow in the imperial footsteps of world powers before us, taking and annexing other territories for our benefit? This debate is playing itself out all across American politics, and it's around this time that John L. O'Sullivan has an idea brewing in his head. He's the owner and editor of a large newspaper called the United States Magazine, very original name, and in the July issue finds himself arguing in favor of a certain philosophy. A terrible, awful idea that will come to be known as manifest destiny. It's the idea that American expansion is unavoidable. In fact, it's America's heavenly mission, O'Sullivan writes, signed and approved of by God himself, to bring peace, freedom, and justice to the nation by claiming and developing the territory around it. The country is vast and full of untapped resources just waiting to be claimed by noble capitalists who will seize them and convert them into wealth. This, of course, ushers in a wave of exploitative tragedies too long and too difficult to list here. Let's just say this experiment turns out exactly like you'd expect. And the resulting wealth is rarely, if ever, shared by the country's non-white residents. Slavery is still a driving economic force, Asian immigrants are often forced into exploitative labor, and Native Americans often find themselves on the losing end as America ravages the land. But regardless of its wastefulness and distinct white supremacist flavor, the idea of manifest destiny was the predominant sentiment across the country. And it's during this period that America turns its eyes beyond the borders of the continent itself, to a little Spanish colony called Cuba. Now, the relationship between Cuba and Spain goes back centuries, and has historically been pretty dicey. Since Christopher Columbus arrived on the island in 1492, Cuba has witnessed an endless cycle of slavery and economic exploitation by Spanish colonists. Revolution after revolution has tried and failed to win Cuban independence, And if we fast forward to 1886, all that tension is coming to a head. Cubans have a fierce independence streak and dream of a day when the only people who can decide the political fate of the country are free Cubans. So, after the end of slavery on the island and some major socioeconomic shifts, the seeds of revolution are growing again. But if this time is going to work and Cuba really is to be an independent nation, they're going to need some help. Now, at this point, the most obvious ally seems to be the United States, who are plenty eager to have Spain off their doorstep. The problem is, the US won't stop looking at Cuba like a hungry dog. Cuba is a major exporter of America's favorite drug, sugar. And if the US could claim those valuable Cuban sugarcane fields for themselves, it would add a great deal of wealth to the country's capitalist collection. Secretary of State James G. Blaine even wrote, "That rich island, the key to the Gulf of Mexico, is, though in the hands of Spain, a part of the American commercial system. If ever ceasing to be Spanish, Cuba must necessarily become American and not fall under any other European domination." America has manifest destiny on the mind, and Cuba is looking more and more like an opportunity it can't pass up. And it's worth taking a little detour here to establish a theme that we'll revisit over and over: propaganda. Or, more specifically, the American newspaper. In the 19th century, newspapers were king, and every major printer very quickly discovered that the war for independence in Cuba made for fantastic headlines. Americans developed a sort of media fixation with the island and grew really sympathetic to the Cuban struggle. Papers were flying off the shelves with every new development, and what better way to drum up support for a Caribbean neighbor than to, quite literally, just make stuff up. As tensions grew in Cuba and America chomped at the bit for war with Spain, propaganda began circulating about unspeakable Spanish atrocities. Sensationalist tales of Spanish soldiers murdering, raping, and pillaging thousands of innocent Cuban homes dominated the news. All based, of course, on third or fourth or fifth-hand stories, sometimes no stories at all. Now, that's not to say that the Spanish were entirely off the hook for any wrongdoing, far from it. But it was impossible to know what was true and what wasn't. And quite frankly, it didn't matter. America was eating it up. So when the US Maine exploded off the coast of Cuba and blamed on a Spanish attack, American support for the revolution was at an all-time high. There was no need for further provocation. America would take up arms in defense of their poor Cuban brethren and drive the Spanish out of the country. And of course, out of those beautiful, lush sugarcane fields. The ensuing conflict comes to be known as the Spanish-American War, or the Cuban War for Independence. And long story short, America launches what is essentially an invasion of Cuba. There's lots of shooting and fighting, and in July of 1898, Spain surrenders. With the help of the United States and centuries of hardship and revolution, it's starting to look like Cuba might finally be a free nation, independent of Spanish rule. America, on the other hand, has a different idea. That's next time, in part 2 of How America Broke Cuba. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and if you know somebody who might be interested in this content, make sure and share it as well. I'm a brand new channel and every little bit helps. Stay tuned for plenty of content on the way.